The Senate Judiciary Committee chamber thrummed with an almost electric unease as Senator Josh Hawley leaned closer to his microphone, a faintly patronizing smile playing at his lips. For nearly 20 minutes, Representative Jasmine Crockett had been methodically tearing apart the foundations of his proposed constitutional amendment. Her arguments precise, her citations impeccable, and her tone unflinching. "Representative Crockett," Hawley said finally, his voice carrying the polished arrogance of a man long accustomed to hearing it echo in important rooms. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I suspect there's been a little misunderstanding. My Yale law degree and time clerking at the Supreme Court suggest that I might have a slightly deeper grasp of constitutional jurisprudence than someone trained at the University of Houston Law Center. Perhaps in Texas, they teach interpretation a bit differently than at the institutions that have shaped American constitutional thought for generations." A ripple of uneasy murmurs spread through the packed gallery. Committee members exchanged glances, surprised by how quickly the senator's argument had slipped from substance into condescension. Crockett didn't flinch. She sat completely still for 3 long seconds, studying Hawley with the calm precision of someone accustomed to waiting out arrogance in a courtroom. Then, slowly, she reached for her microphone. "Senator Hawley," she began, her voice deliberate yet sharp enough to cut through the room's tension. "While you were writing scholarly essays at Yale, I was standing before the Fifth Circuit successfully arguing on the very constitutional questions you're referencing. When you were clerking for a single justice, I was litigating cases that set precedent in 3 separate circuits. And when your amendment misquotes Harrington v. California, it misreads Justice Douglas's reasoning, something I know intimately because I interviewed his last living clerk while preparing Jenkins v. Texas, which I argued and won 8-1 before the Supreme Court last year. So yes, Senator," she concluded, her tone now carrying quiet steel, "perhaps we do teach constitutional law differently in Texas, with a focus on application, not pedigree." The hearing room froze. The murmuring stopped. Even the veteran legal correspondents paused mid-keystroke, realizing they were witnessing a moment that would ripple far beyond this committee room. Hawley's confident smirk faded into an awkward stillness. Around him, members of both chambers straightened in their chairs, alert now, aware they were seeing one of the most deft public dismantlings of intellectual arrogance in recent congressional memory. Before exploring this extraordinary exchange between 2 of the country's sharpest legal minds, don't forget to comment where you're tuning in from, and subscribe so you won't miss our latest deep dive political analysis. Representative Jasmine Crockett's rise in Congress had been built not on theatrics or sound bites, but on mastery of law, language, and logic. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, where she served as editor of the Law Review, Crockett spent 15 years practicing constitutional law before ever running for office. Her reputation wasn't born in academic seminars, but forged in appellate courts where she successfully argued voting rights and equal protection, cases that reshaped interpretations across multiple circuits. By the time she arrived in Washington, she had already authored amicus briefs cited in Supreme Court majority opinions and been inducted into the American Law Institute. Her scholarly work, though written outside the Ivy League, had appeared in the Harvard Law Review and Stanford Law Review, a testament to her intellectual reach. "The Constitution," she once said during her first campaign, "isn't a museum piece. It's a living framework meant to protect ordinary Americans from extraordinary power." At 42, Crockett carried herself with the same deliberate intensity that had defined her courtroom career. She approached every committee hearing like oral argument, briefed, footnoted, and grounded in precedent. Colleagues often noted she didn't rely on staff summaries. Instead, she personally combed through legislative history and judicial opinions until she understood every nuance. Senator Josh Hawley, by contrast, had carved his path through pedigree. Stanford undergraduate, Yale law graduate, clerk to Chief Justice John Roberts, and later a constitutional law professor before ascending to political prominence. His intellectual brand was rooted in originalism, the belief that constitutional interpretation should mirror the intent of the founders. Within conservative legal circles, his writings on federalism had elevated him to near celebrity status. The proposed amendment that brought him and Crockett into direct conflict, the Electoral Federalism Amendment, sought to redefine the balance of power between states and the federal government in election oversight. In Hawley's words, it was meant to restore the founders' vision of electoral sovereignty, ensuring states, not Washington, controlled election procedures. Critics, however, saw it as a blueprint for weakening federal protections under the Voting Rights Act. The hearing was rare, a joint session of the Senate and House Judiciary Committees, a format reserved for constitutional amendments of exceptional consequence. The atmosphere inside the chamber carried the tension of something historic. When Chairman Dick Durbin struck the gavel at precisely 10 a.m., Hawley rose with the ease of a man in familiar territory. For 15 minutes, he lectured with professorial authority, citing the Federalist Papers, early debates from the Constitutional Convention, and the writings of Madison and Hamilton to support his argument that states had always been the rightful stewards of election procedures. The founders intended for states to govern their own elections, Hawley declared. This amendment doesn't rewrite the Constitution. It restores its original meaning. When he concluded, Durbin nodded. Representative Crockett, you have the floor. Crockett adjusted her microphone and offered a brief smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, she said evenly, then turned toward Hawley. Senator, I appreciate your attention to the founders' intent. However, your analysis omits nearly 2 centuries of constitutional evolution, particularly the Reconstruction Amendments, which reshaped the relationship between states and the federal government. She flipped open a well-worn copy of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 4 reads, "The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations." Your amendment, however, appears to directly contradict that plain text. How do you reconcile that? For the first time, Hawley hesitated. Representative Crockett, he began. Recovering his composure, the framers intended that clause as a safeguard, a contingency against state failure, not a blanket grant of federal power. Modern interpretations have expanded it far beyond its original scope. Crockett nodded slightly. That's an interesting argument, she said, but history tells a different story. In 1842, Congress mandated that House members be elected from districts, overriding states that refused to comply. The Supreme Court upheld that law in Ex parte Siebold, affirming that Congress's authority under Article 1, Section 4 is paramount. And more importantly, she continued, her voice steady and deliberate, your historical lens seems frozen in 1789, ignoring the constitutional revolutions of the Reconstruction Amendments that explicitly empowered federal intervention to protect equal voting rights. The chamber fell quiet again, every word she spoke cutting clean through centuries of legal theory and political posturing. The 15th Amendment explicitly grants Congress enforcement power regarding racial discrimination in voting. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause has been consistently interpreted to authorize federal intervention when state election procedures discriminate as affirmed in Harper v. KEP, Virginia Board of Elections, and subsequent cases. This historically nuanced critique delivered without notes revealed Crockett's deep constitutional expertise. Hawley shifted approach, moving from historical arguments to textual analysis of his amendment. My amendment preserves these constitutional protections, he countered. Section 2 explicitly allows federal action where necessary to protect constitutional rights. This simply establishes a proper balance between state authority and federal oversight. I appreciate that clarification, Crockett responded. But the language in Section 3 seems to undermine that balance. It requires courts to apply strict scrutiny to federal election regulations, a standard typically reserved for potential constitutional violations. This effectively treats congressional exercise of its explicit Article 1 authority as presumptively unconstitutional, inverting the constitutional hierarchy established by the Supremacy Clause. She displayed the amendment text on screen, highlighting specific language. Furthermore, Section 3B states that courts shall not defer to congressional findings of fact when reviewing federal election regulations. This directly contradicts established separation of powers, principles dating back to McCulloch v. Maryland, where Chief Justice Marshall established that Congress has latitude to determine necessary and proper means for exercising its constitutional powers. This precise legal analysis, identifying specific constitutional contradictions rather than general concerns, seemed to catch Hawley off guard. He responded with increasing defensiveness, shifting from constitutional substance to procedural objections. Representative Crockett, with all due respect, you're misinterpreting both my amendment and the constitutional principles it embodies. The amendment preserves congressional authority while preventing overreach. I'm struggling to reconcile that assertion with the amendment's actual text, Crockett replied. Section 1 states that the power to determine them manner of holding elections is reserved to the states. This absolute language directly contradicts Article 1, Section 4's explicit grant of congressional authority to make or alter state election regulations, she continued without referencing notes. This contradiction creates a fundamental constitutional problem. Under Article 5, amendments can change constitutional provisions but cannot create irreconcilable internal contradictions. The Supreme Court established this principle in Sprague v. United States, noting that amendments must be integrated into the constitutional whole rather than creating isolated provisions that contradict foundational structures. This invocation of a relatively obscure constitutional doctrine delivered with the precision of a law professor visibly frustrated Hawley. Rather than engaging with the substantive legal critique, he attempted to dismiss it by questioning Crockett's credentials. "Representative Crockett," Hawley said, his voice carrying throughout the chamber, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I think there's some confusion here. My Yale Law degree in Supreme Court clerkship suggests I might understand constitutional jurisprudence a bit better than someone from the University of Houston Law Center. Perhaps in Texas, they teach constitutional interpretation differently than at the institutions that have shaped American legal thought for centuries." The personal attack, unusual in a committee focused on constitutional in Texas substance, created a palpable tension in the room. Several committee members appeared startled by the shift from legal debate to credential comparison. Representative Crockett sat motionless for 3 seconds, her expression unreadable as she studied the senator. When she finally spoke, her voice remained measured, but carried unmistakable authority. "Senator Hawley," she began, "while you were writing academic articles at Yale, I was successfully arguing before the Fifth Circuit on the very constitutional provisions we're discussing today. When you clerked for one justice, I was litigating cases that established precedent across 3 circuits. And when your amendment cites Harrington v. California, it fundamentally misinterprets Justice Douglas's opinion, which I know because I personally interviewed Justice Douglas's last living clerk while preparing for Jenkins v. Texas, which I won 8-1 before the Supreme Court last year. So yes, perhaps we do teach constitutional law differently in Texas, with an emphasis on practical application rather than theoretical credentials." The response, precise, factual, and devastating in its substance, created absolute silence in the hearing room. Several committee members visibly reacted, some exchanging glances of surprise, others quickly reviewing their notes as if suddenly reassessing the dynamics of the hearing. Chairman Durbin, recognizing the significance of the exchange, intervened smoothly. "I appreciate both members' perspectives on these important constitutional questions. Let's continue with questions from other committee members." But the dynamic of the hearing had fundamentally changed. What began as a routine committee session had transformed into a defining moment that legal observers would later describe as the day credentials collided with actual constitutional expertise as questioning continued. The impact of the exchange between Crockett and Hawley reverberated through the committee room in subtle but unmistakable ways. Committee members who'd initially directed their questions primarily to Hawley now increasingly sought Crockett's perspective on constitutional implications. Senator Klobuchar, a former prosecutor, posed a question that reflected this shift. "Representative Crockett, given your experience litigating constitutional cases, could you elaborate on how the proposed amendment might affect existing voting rights jurisprudence? I'm particularly interested in potential impacts on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act." This question, focused on practical constitutional implications rather than abstract theory, played directly to Crockett's strengths. Her response demonstrated both doctrinal command and practical litigation experience. "Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. The amendment created several significant tensions with established voting rights jurisprudence." She explained Section 3's strict scrutiny requirement would fundamentally alter the analytical framework established in Thornburg v. Gingles and refined in subsequent cases. Currently, Section 2 claims are evaluated under a totality of circumstances test to determine discriminatory effects by imposing strict scrutiny on federal voting regulations. The amendment would effectively reverse this burden, requiring the federal government to prove compelling interest and narrow tailoring for each application of Section 2. She displayed a flowchart illustrating current VRA litigation procedures alongside the changes the amendment would create. This procedural shift would significantly impact cases like the recent litigation in North Carolina, State Conference of the NAACP versus McCroy, where the Fourth Circuit identified discriminatory intent in voter ID provisions. Under this amendment, the court would have been required to apply strict scrutiny to the VRA itself, rather than to the state's potentially discriminatory action. This detailed, technically precise analysis focusing on specific doctrinal implications rather than general concerns, visibly impressed committee members from both parties. Senator Cornyn, a conservative with significant judicial experience, followed up with a question that would have been unthinkable before the confrontation. Representative Crockett, from your litigation experience, how might courts reconcile the amendment's Section 3 judicial review provisions with existing standards for reviewing congressional action under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment? The question opened the door for Crockett to address one of the amendment's most significant constitutional vulnerabilities, which she handled with characteristic precision. That's an insightful question, Senator Cornyn. The amendment creates a direct doctrinal conflict with established Section 5 jurisprudence. In City of Bourne v. Flores, the court established that Congress has broad enforcement authority under Section 5, when addressing discrimination, requiring only that legislation be congruent and proportional to the constitutional violation being remedied. She displayed text from the City of Bourne decision alongside the amendment's language. Section 3 of the amendment would replace this congruent and proportional standard with strict scrutiny for election regulations, effectively nullifying Congress's Section 5 enforcement power in the electoral context. This creates an irreconcilable tension between two constitutional provisions: Section 5's explicit grant of congressional enforcement authority and the amendment's restrictions on that same authority. This nuanced constitutional analysis, identifying specific doctrinal conflicts rather than general objections, further established Crockett's command of both constitutional theory and practical litigation implications. Throughout this portion of the hearing, Senator Hawley remained uncharacteristically subdued. The Missouri senator, normally quick with responses and follow-up questions, appeared to be recalibrating his approach following the earlier exchange. When he did speak again, his tone had noticeably shifted from dismissive to more substantively engaged. Representative Crockett, Hawley began, his tone now carefully neutral. You've raised important questions about potential conflicts with Reconstruction Amendment jurisprudence. How might the amendment be modified to address these concerns while still preserving the principle of state primacy in election administration? This question, seeking substantive improvement rather than defensive justification, represented a tacit acknowledgement of the constitutional issues Crockett had identified. The shift wasn't lost on experienced committee observers, one of whom later described it as the senatorial equivalent of extending an olive branch after recognizing you've significantly underestimated your opponent. Crockett answered with the same measured expertise she had demonstrated throughout. That's a constructive question, Senator Hawley. The fundamental tension could be addressed by modifying Section 3's judicial review provisions to recognize the distinct constitutional status of legislation enacted under the Reconstruction Amendments. Perhaps language specifying that nothing in this amendment shall be construed to limit congressional enforcement power under the 14th and 15th Amendments would preserve both state authority and general election, administration, and federal authority to protect constitutional rights. She continued with specific drafting suggestions. Additionally, replacing Section 3's strict scrutiny requirement with a substantial relations standard would better align with existing federalism jurisprudence, while still providing meaningful judicial review. This approach would be consistent with the court's analysis in cases like Shelby County versus Holder, where the court recognized both state sovereignty interests and federal protection mandates. As Crockett outlined these targeted improvements, committee members listened with growing attention. The conversation had transformed from partisan positioning to substantive constitutional analysis, precisely the kind of deliberative refinement that congressional hearings were designed to facilitate but rarely achieved. Chairman Durbin, recognizing the productive shift in the hearing's tone, extended questioning time. I believe the committee is benefiting from this detailed constitutional analysis. As questioning continued, Senator Blumenthal, a former state attorney general, asked a question that further highlighted Crockett's practical legal experience. Representative Crockett, having litigated constitutional cases, could you address how this amendment might affect pending election litigation in federal courts? That's an important practical consideration, Senator Crockett responded. The amendment Section 4 contains language that could be interpreted to apply retroactively to pending cases. This raises serious separation of powers concerns under the court's decision in Plout versus Spendthrift Farm, which established that Congress cannot retroactively command the federal courts to reopen final judgments. While the amendment doesn't explicitly require reopening final cases, its language that courts shall apply this amendment to all pending cases creates constitutional tensions with Article 3's vesting of judicial power. This analysis focused on practical litigation implications rather than abstract theory, further distinguished Crockett's approach from Hawley's earlier emphasis on historical originalism. The contrast was not lost on committee members who increasingly directed their most substantive questions to Crockett. Senator Hawley, recognizing this shift in committee dynamics, made a final attempt to reassert his constitutional expertise while acknowledging Crockett's substantive points. "I appreciate Representative Crockett's technical analysis," he stated. "While I maintain that the amendment's core purpose is constitutionally sound, her suggestions regarding potential conflicts with Reconstruction Amendment jurisprudence merits serious consideration. Perhaps we can work together to refine the language while preserving the principle of state primacy in election administration." This conciliatory approach, acknowledging the validity of Crockett's constitutional critique while maintaining his position on core principles, represented a significant shift from his earlier dismissive tone. Chairman Durbin seized the opportunity to promote constructive collaboration. "I appreciate Senator Hawley's willingness to consider refinements based on Representative Crockett's analysis. Would the two of you be willing to work together on amendment language addressing these constitutional tensions before our next hearing?" Both members agreed, creating a surprising moment of collaboration that committee veterans later described as the most constructive possible outcome from what began as a credential-focused confrontation. As the hearing concluded, the transformation was complete. What began with Hawley dismissively referencing his Yale law degree had evolved into a substantive discussion of specific constitutional doctrines, with both members agreeing to collaborate on improvements. The committee had witnessed not just a personal confrontation, but a victory for substantive constitutional analysis over credential-based authority. In her closing remarks, Crockett maintained the same measured substance-focused approach that had defined her participation throughout. Constitutional amendments require the most careful consideration, not because change is impossible, but because we must ensure new provisions harmonize with existing constitutional structures. I look forward to working with Senator Hawley to address these doctrinal tensions, while respecting the legitimate federalism concerns his amendment seeks to address. As members gathered their materials after adjournment, several committee members approached Crockett to continue discussion of specific constitutional provisions. The difference they showed to her expertise, regardless of partisan affiliation, represented the most meaningful vindication of her approach to the hearing. For legal correspondents covering the committee, the story had transformed from routine partisan disagreement to something far more substantive. A veteran Supreme Court reporter was overheard telling a colleague, "That wasn't just a comeback. That was a masterclass in how practical constitutional expertise trumps credentials when properly deployed." By evening, clips of the exchange between Representative Crockett and Senator Hawley had spread widely across traditional and social media platforms. What caught viewers' attention, however, wasn't merely the personal confrontation, but the substantive contrast between credential-based authority and demonstrated constitutional expertise. The New York Times legal affairs correspondent captured this distinction in an analysis titled "Beyond Credentials: The Crockett-Hawley Exchange as Constitutional Moment." The article noted that beyond the personal drama, yesterday's hearing represented something increasingly rare in constitutional discourse, a debate where specific legal knowledge and litigation experience prevailed over institutional pedigree and theoretical credentials. Legal scholars across the political spectrum acknowledged the significance of the size exchange, though they characterized it differently. Conservative legal commentator Orrin Kerr observed, Senator Hawley made a tactical error by shifting from substantive debate to credential comparison in an area where Representative Crockett clearly possessed superior practical expertise. The lesson is an ideological but methodological constitutional analysis requires more than prestigious degrees. Progressive constitutional scholar Lawrence Tribe offered a different perspective. What made Crockett's response so effective wasn't just her litigation experience, but how she deployed it. She didn't engage in abstract theorizing or partisan positioning. She identified specific doctrinal tensions and proposed concrete solutions. That's constitutional lawyering at its finest, regardless of where one studied. For Hawley, the aftermath required careful navigation. His initial response, a tweet stating that rigorous constitutional debate strengthens our democratic institutions, was widely seen as an attempt to reframe the confrontation as routine committee business. This characterization gained little traction, as more people watched the full exchange and recognized its exceptional nature. 3 days after the hearing, Hawley demonstrated political acumen by taking a more direct approach. In an interview on Fox News, he acknowledged, Representative Crockett raised legitimate constitutional questions about potential tensions with Reconstruction Amendment jurisprudence. While we approach constitutional interpretation differently, I respect her litigation experience and practical insights. That's why we're working together. to refine the amendment's language to address these doctrinal concerns. This forthright acknowledgement rather than continued emphasis on his Yale credentials earned Hawley praise for intellectual honesty. A senior legal correspondent noted, "In recognizing Crockett's substantive critique without abandoning his principles, Senator Hawley has transformed what could have been an embarrassing moment into a demonstration of constitutional statesmanship." For Crockett, the aftermath brought increased attention to her approach to constitutional analysis. Law schools requested permission to use video of the exchange in classes on constitutional litigation and doctrinal development. The American Constitution Society and Federalist Society, ideological opposites in the legal world, both invited her to address their annual conventions on practical constitutional interpretation. In an interview on CNN's State of the Union, Crockett maintained her focus on substance rather than personal vindication. When asked about the confrontation with Hawley, she redirected, "What matters isn't where we studied law, but how we apply constitutional principles to protect Americans' rights. Senator Hawley and I are now working together to address potential doctrinal conflicts in the amendment while respecting legitimate federalism concerns." That constructive engagement is far more significant than any single exchange during a hearing. This response, prioritizing constitutional substance over personal triumph, reinforced Crockett's reputation as a serious legal thinker, more interested in doctrinal clarity than partisan advantage. The substantive impact extended beyond personal reputations. 2 weeks after the hearing, the Senate Judiciary Committee released a significantly revised version of the proposed amendment. The new draft, officially credited to Hawley Crockett, contained substantial modifications addressing the constitutional tensions Crockett had identified. The revised amendment maintained the principle of state primacy in election administration while adding explicit language preserving congressional authority under the Reconstruction Amendments. Section 3's strict scrutiny requirement had been replaced with a more nuanced, heightened scrutiny standard that better aligned with existing federalism jurisprudence, and Section 4 had been modified to address the retroactivity concerns Crockett had raised regarding pending litigation. In a joint press conference announcing the revised amendment, both members emphasized different aspects while acknowledging their collaboration. Hawley highlighted the preservation of state primacy in general election administration, while Crockett emphasized the strengthened protections for voting rights enforcement. This balanced presentation, each maintaining their constitutional principles while acknowledging the legitimacy of the other's concerns, represented a model of how substantive legal disagreements could be productively navigated. For constitutional scholars, the revision process itself became worthy of study. Harvard Law Review published an analysis titled "Constitutional Dialogue in Practice: The Hawley-Crockett Amendment Process," noting that the evolution from Hawley's original proposal to the Hawley-Crockett revision demonstrates how substantive constitutional critique and practical litigation expertise can refine constitutional texts to better harmonize with existing constitutional structures. Perhaps most significantly, the Crockett-Hawley exchange catalyzed a broader conversation about legal credentials versus practical expertise in constitutional interpretation. Editorial boards across the country published thoughtful analyses examining how legal education and practice shape constitutional understanding. Representative Crockett's experience litigating the constitutional provisions at issue proved more valuable than Senator Hawley's prestigious credentials, wrote a constitutional scholar in The Atlantic. This raises important questions about how we evaluate constitutional expertise. Are we overvaluing elite institutional affiliations at the expense of practical litigation experience? And what does this suggest about diversifying the perspectives that shape constitutional development? 6 months after the confrontation, its impact continued to resonate in legal education circles. Several top law schools announced initiatives to incorporate more practical litigation experience into their constitutional law curriculum, explicitly citing the Crockett-Hawley exchange as demonstrating the importance of practical application alongside theoretical understanding. Yale Law School Dean Heather Gerken acknowledged this shift in legal education philosophy. While we're proud of our theoretical traditions, the Crockett-Hawley exchange reminded us that constitutional interpretation requires both doctrinal understanding and practical application. We're expanding our constitutional litigation offerings to better prepare students for the kind of substantive analysis Representative Crockett demonstrated. The legislative impact extended beyond the specific amendment. When a major voting rights bill reached Congress the following year, the drafting process explicitly incorporated what had become known as the Crockett method, identifying potential doctrinal conflicts early and addressing them through specific textual solutions rather than general savings clauses. For those studying constitutional development, The Crockett-Hawley exchange and subsequent collaboration became a case study in effective constitutional dialogue. The Congressional Research Service published an analysis titled, "From Confrontation to Collaboration: The Crockett-Hawley Model of Constitutional Refinement," documenting how the initial confrontation ultimately led to stronger constitutional text through substantive engagement rather than credential-based authority. 3 years later, when a modified version of the Hawley-Crockett Amendment was ratified by the required 3/4 of state legislatures, both members were invited to speak at the ratification ceremony. Their joint remarks, Hawley emphasizing the amendment's protection of state authority and Crockett highlighting its preservation of federal voting rights enforcement, demonstrated how their initial confrontation had evolved into a constitutional partnership that strengthened rather than weakened the amendment's legal foundation. For legal practitioners, the confrontation and its aftermath offered a powerful reminder that constitutional expertise comes in many forms beyond prestigious credentials. A prominent law firm hiring partner later observed, "We've started looking more closely at actual litigation experience rather than just law school pedigrees." The Crockett-Hawley exchange showed that understanding how constitutional provisions actually function in courtrooms is at least as valuable as theoretical knowledge of original meaning. The lasting legacy of the confrontation wasn't personal victory or defeat, but a model of how constitutional dialogue should ideally function. In an era often dominated by partisan positioning and credential-based authority, the Crockett-Hawley exchange offered a glimpse of substantive constitutional development, focused on doctrinal clarity and practical application, rather than institutional pedigree or political advantage. As a senior constitutional scholar observed 3 years later, what began with a dismissive reference to Yale law ended with a stronger constitutional amendment that better harmonized with existing constitutional structures. That's not just a personal triumph for either legislator. It's a victory for constitutional development when it functions as the founders intended. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of today's most important constitutional developments. Leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on how credentials and practical experience shape effective constitutional interpretation.